All right, in this video, we're going to be providing just a kind of brief walkthrough of this concept of business ethics and talk briefly through some of the different things that influence business ethics within an organization. So to start us off, what is business ethics? The best way that I can describe business ethics is it simply represents what we would call principles and standards that determine acceptable conduct in business. And these principles and standards are really important because in a business setting, we need to be able to understand what are the essential rules of the game, so to speak, and what is going to be acceptable versus unacceptable behavior. Now, when we think about business ethics, a lot of times we think about our own individual ethics, right? We think about our own individual beliefs about what is right and what is wrong. And this, while there is some degree of consistency between person to person, right? We have established laws around things that we view as a society that is something that is particularly unethical. There can be varying degrees of what is considered to be okay from person to person. Now, the challenge is within a business context is you have a significant motivation for making sure that your employees act in an ethical manner because there are huge downsides associated with engaging in unethical behavior. And we've seen huge examples of this. For example, Wells Fargo opening fake accounts or incentivizing folks to open fake accounts for a variety of different reasons, but as a way to kind of attain certain monetary type bonuses. So when we're thinking about what impacts business ethics, we usually think about three things, three specific factors that are going to have an influence on business ethics. Now, what I do want to emphasize is individually, each one of these isn't going to entirely sway a particular decision and affect the extent to which people engage in good ethical behavior. But these are the three factors that are going to have an impact on the decisions that we make within an organization. Now, the first one, and one that we've kind of already explored to an extent, is going to be the individual standards and values, or individuals' standards and values. And we as individuals, we bring with us our own past history and a variety of different things that shape the extent to which we think certain things are acceptable or unacceptable. And that can be everything from our upbringing in the kind of family context in which we were raised and, parents and those sorts of things. It could be religion. It could be certain life events that have shaped kind of our viewpoint and those sorts of things. And so we as individuals, obviously that is a huge emphasis on what we consider to be right and wrong based upon our own individual standards and values. Now, in addition to that, we also have manager and coworker influence. And this is, of course, the extent to which we are influenced by our surroundings. And we know from a variety of different studies that we have the ability to be influenced based upon what is happening in our external environment, right? There's a certain phenomenon in psychology that's discussed called social proof, which is the idea that when we're in a scenario or a situation and we're not quite sure socially what's the kind of traditional mode or norms, the ways of operating, we kind of look to our surroundings to see, what is acceptable behavior, right? If we're walking somewhere and we're not sure, kind of where to go, we're sort of like following, a group of people that seems to be heading in the same direction. And so we kind of look for those cues when we're new to an organization and we're unaware of, hey, what are the acceptable standards for like greeting my boss, for example? Or if it's acceptable to leave early or before the boss, I'm going to look to the surrounding environment and I'm going to see what my coworkers do and, what's acceptable dress on a Friday. I'm going to look at what are people wearing on a Friday. And so those are kind of those things, although a little bit simplistic, that have an influence on our behavior. Thinking about the power of this, right? Specifically, I mentioned at the beginning of the video, Wells Fargo and some of the issues that they had relating to opening up fake accounts. If you're put in an environment where everyone around you is opening up fake accounts, at a certain point, does it become normal? Does that become just kind of the way that things are done? And does it desensitize us to that kind of method of operating? You can take, someone who would by and large independently be a very ethical person. If you put them in an environment where they're surrounded by people who are consistently engaging in the wrong behaviors, and I would imagine that person, under the right conditions, could be kind of influenced into doing things that they wouldn't ordinarily do simply because of that kind of societal pressure. And so that becomes a really important element, and we'll kind of talk through some ways to overcome this, but that becomes a really important element to why people engage in certain behaviors. Now, the last one, number 3, is going to be kind of codes and compliance requirements. And this has to do with, and I'm sure you're kind of imagining what this is. This has to do with really established codes of conduct and things, trainings, orientations, and those types of things that I'm sure don't necessarily bring up super fond memories as you have been acclimated to a new employer. But those types of things help kind of establish sort of the rules for acceptable behavior and kind of get everyone on the same page, for lack of a better way of describing it, in terms of what are the things that we consider to be okay. And some of them are maybe fairly obvious, right? Like you shouldn't take things that aren't yours. But then some of the things maybe could be new depending upon, kind of your culture or your background or just something else that has an influence on kind of your perceptions of ethical behavior. Now, when we're thinking about these 3 kind of factors from an organizational perspective, right, I really want to try to influence the people that work for me in a positive way so that they do the right things, right? And I know that, do the right things sounds a little subjective, right? But of course, by establishing kind of codes of compliance requirements, codes of conduct, by, having those sorts of things, even though some of it feels a little bit like window dressing, the idea is that we're going to try to shape, really the extent to which managers and coworkers can influence other people on the job. We're going to try to establish some kind of common standards so that even though we all have individual standards and values, that we create sort of this consistency that could be uniformly applied and that is more likely to encourage us to engage in positive behaviors that are going to reflect positively on the company itself, right? And so from an employment standpoint, right, when we think about all these different things, and chances are if you're employed and you've seen like a code of conduct list that you probably don't remember, once you get past maybe the first 2, because a lot of that stuff, we tend to notice it once and that's about it. But being able to kind of address manager and coworker influence is huge, because we've seen time and time again when there are these ethics scandals, it typically is a result of behavior that maybe unintentionally doesn't get addressed, and that encourages such behavior to continue, and then it begins to spread almost the equivalent of like wildfire would. And so from an employment standpoint, we really need to be able to identify those unwanted behaviors and making sure that we're encouraging the right ones and obviously discouraging those that aren't contributing towards creating this climate that's really based upon ethical behavior. So I hope that gives you a good understanding of really just business ethics in general, right? These principles and standards that are going to be used to determine what is acceptable behavior or conduct in the business context, but also the individual factors. And because of the fact that we share these individual standards and values, that makes ethics in a workplace incredibly complex, because not everybody is the same. We all have different personalities and upbringings and cultures and these things that obviously make us wonderfully unique, and that's fantastic, but create this dynamic that makes it very difficult to have one kind of agreement, I guess, on what should be acceptable behavior. And so from an employment standpoint, we want to try to encourage the behaviors that are going to lead to positive outcomes. We want to try to address those behaviors that obviously aren't linked to good ethics. And we do that by trying to put things in writing, trying to do trainings, orientations, all those sorts of things, so that people understand what is considered to be acceptable behavior.